Imagine returning home after a long journey. The flight was long, the air stale, the exhaustion deep. But home, that sacred refuge awaits. You reach for your key, the same key you've turned countless times before, a simple motion, an unthinking act until now. But something is wrong. The key, the one that should open the door to warmth, to familiarity, to the life she has always known, no longer fits. It is as if she has been erased. In an instant, everything she once knew is gone. Her name, her place, her very existence vanished at the turn of a lock. Was this justice? Was it vengeance? Or was it something far darker? An email, a subject line, we need to talk. A photo, blurred, incriminating. A husband's silence, thick with unspoken rage. And then a decision, cold, unforgiving. She pounds on the door now, once, twice, again, a plea, a whisper, a scream. But on the other side, only silence. Stay until the end, as we uncover the shocking twist in this real-life story of love, betrayal, and exile. Their marriage had not always been this way. There was a time when laughter filled the spaces between them, when the quiet companionship of shared meals and late-night conversations formed the foundation of their life together. They had built something, something that felt solid, unshakable, a home, a partnership, and understanding. In the early years, Martha was thriving. A journalist by trade, her work had given her purpose. Her columns were read by thousands. Her insights respected, her voice sought after. There had been a time when she was the one leaving the house early in the morning, chasing deadlines, attending meetings, being part of something greater than herself. She had been the one with stories to tell, the one who was admired, the one who was moving forward. But then the industry shifted. The recession swept through the publishing world, cutting away jobs with ruthless efficiency. Contracts were lost. Columns were discontinued. Offers that once came freely began to dwindle. Then they stopped entirely. Martha watched as colleagues disappeared from newsrooms, their seats left empty, their futures uncertain. And soon it was her turn. One day she was a journalist. The next she was nothing. The change was gradual, then absolute. With no work, no projects, no sense of direction, she found herself at home. At first she tried to stay productive. She pitched ideas, sent inquiries, waited for replies that never came. The silence was suffocating. Days blurred together. She spent hours in front of her laptop, scrolling through emails that never refreshed, playing endless rounds of solitaire. Smoking became a habit, something to do with her hands as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall. While Martha's world shrank, Robert's expanded. A writer like his wife, his career had taken an entirely different turn. His work was in demand. His name was being mentioned in the right circles, his talent recognized. He was out at book launches, at dinners, at meetings that ran late into the night. While she was home, he was elsewhere, immersed in conversations, shaking hands with publishers, speaking on panels. He was earning more than he ever had, rising higher than he had expected, stepping into a life that was widening in front of him. At first, she had been proud. She celebrated his success, encouraged him, waited for the nights when he would come home and tell her about his day. But the stories became shorter, the conversations less frequent, and eventually they stopped altogether. He would return late, his words few, his attention elsewhere. There were nights when she would ask how his day had been, only to receive a vague response. There were mornings when she would wake up alone, his side of the bed empty, his absence unspoken. She wondered if he even noticed how much had changed, if he saw how quiet she had become, how restless, how lost. There were days when she would sit across from him at the breakfast table, searching his face for any trace of the man she had married. But he was preoccupied, his mind elsewhere, his focus always just beyond her reach. She tried to talk, to bring back what had been lost, but the effort felt one-sided. He would nod, he would offer brief acknowledgments, but the engagement was gone. Resentment grew in the spaces between them. It was not immediate, nor was it explosive. It was slow, creeping, settling into their home unnoticed. She began to feel invisible, unimportant, a presence that no longer mattered in the way it once had. He, too, must have felt it, though he never said. Perhaps he had already made peace with it. Perhaps he had decided that there was nothing left to fix. Still, Martha tried. She suggested trips, weekends away, something, anything to reconnect. He was always too busy. There was always something more pressing. And so eventually she stopped asking. She stopped waiting. She stopped believing that the marriage she had fought for still existed. And then there was the affair. He had not seen it coming. Or perhaps he had, and he had chosen to ignore it. It had started quietly, unexpectedly. A friendship that turned into something else. A connection that made her feel seen again, that reminded her of what it was like to be heard. He was married, too, but their time together existed in a space separate from their realities. It was not meant to last. It was not meant to matter. It was just something that made her feel like herself again. Or at least, that was what she told herself. But affairs are never truly secret. The signs were there. The late-night messages, the guarded conversations, the sudden shifts in routine. Robert must have sensed it. Maybe he had known long before he confronted her. Maybe the silence between them had been his first clue. When he finally asked, he did not shout. He did not demand explanations. His voice was calm, steady. "Are you having an affair?" A simple question, one she could have denied, but she did not. "Yes," she said, and that was the end of the conversation. She had expected anger. She had expected a confrontation. Instead, he hung up. The silence that followed was worse than any argument could have been. For 10 hours, she heard nothing. She sat on the plane, her mind racing, her hands clenched together in her lap. By the time she landed, she had convinced herself that they would talk, that they would fight, that they would somehow find a way through it. Infidelity is rarely about a single moment. It does not begin with an impulsive act, nor does it appear without warning. It is the culmination of silence, of distance, of needs left unmet. And for Martha, it was never about a grand betrayal, but rather an attempt to escape something she could no longer endure: loneliness. "I felt invisible," she would later say. "I was in a house, but I wasn't in a home. I had a husband, but I was alone." It started as friendship, a familiar face, a person who listened, someone who made her feel like she existed in a way she no longer did with Robert. He was married too, but that did not matter. What mattered was the space they created between them, a space where she felt wanted. Their meetings were never planned, yet they happened with increasing frequency. A conversation that stretched longer than it should have. A dinner that was meant to be innocent but wasn't. A message late at night, a reply that came too quickly. There was a moment when Martha could have stepped back, when she could have chosen a different path. But she did not. The line was crossed, not with intent, but with inevitability. It wasn't about love, she later admitted. It wasn't even about him. It was about me. I needed to feel like I mattered again. But infidelity is never just about those who commit it. It is about those left behind, those who sense the shift before they see the evidence, those who wake up one day and realize that something has changed. Robert had known long before he asked the question. The clues had been there, subtle but undeniable. The distance between them had stretched into something permanent. The late nights, the guarded phone calls, the absent-minded responses. He had once been indifferent to her presence, but now he was hyper-aware of her absences. A laptop left open, an email thread that should not have existed, a photo captured in a moment that was not meant to be seen, proof as undeniable as it was devastating. Infidelity forces a person into two choices: confrontation or silence. For hours, Robert sat with the knowledge, weighing his next move. To accuse her now would invite explanations, justifications, a conversation he was not ready to have. So he waited. Psychologists have long studied the nature of infidelity. Why do people cheat, even when love is still present? Dr. Helen Fisher, a biological anthropologist, suggests that human beings are wired with three distinct brain systems for love: lust, romantic attraction, and long-term attachment. When one system falters, the others seek balance elsewhere. People do not always cheat because they stop loving their partners, Dr. Fisher explains. They cheat because something is missing, something they may not even fully understand themselves. Dr. Esther Perel, a psychotherapist specializing in relationships, expands on this idea. Affairs are less about a rejection of a partner and more about a rejection of the self one has become within a relationship. The affair offers not just another person, but another version of oneself. For Martha, the affair was not about Robert at all. It was about the woman she had once been, the woman she no longer recognized. And for Robert, the betrayal was not just about her actions, but about the realization that she had long since given up on their marriage. Infidelity is often thought of in absolutes, right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal. But the truth is rarely that simple. In the end, it is not the act itself that destroys a marriage. It is what the act reveals. And for Robert, it revealed something he could not forgive. The taxi slows to a stop outside the familiar building. Martha exhales, steadying herself. She is tired, more than tired, the kind of exhaustion that seeps deep into the bones, into the mind, into everything. The weight of her suitcase drags against the pavement as she steps out, rolling it behind her. She reaches the front door, the one she has opened countless times before. Her hands, stiff from the cold, fish the key from her coat pocket. It feels heavier than usual, or perhaps she is just imagining it. She inserts it into the lock. It does not turn. She stops, tries again. A slight twist, a firm push. The key will not budge. She pulls it out, stares at it, flips it over, as if seeing it from a different angle will change something. Another attempt. Nothing. Her breath is audible now, tight and quickened. She steps back, glancing around as if expecting to see someone, anyone, who might explain why the door that should open does not. Then the realization lands, slow and suffocating. The lock has been changed. Her mouth is dry. She swallows hard and knocks. Once, then twice. The sound is dull against the thick wood. Robert? Her voice is controlled, but there is an edge to it. No response. She knocks again, harder this time. Robert, open the door. Still silence. She presses her ear against the surface. The flat is small. He has to be inside. Robert, please. Another knock, louder, insistent. A pause. Then the unmistakable sound of movement. Barely perceptible, but there. She is not alone. He is on the other side. The air shifts, charged with the presence of someone unseen. Her pulse quickens. The door remains closed. She pounds her fist against it now, abandoning any pretense of calm. Robert, let me in. Her voice cracks, and suddenly the exhaustion vanishes, replaced by something raw and unrestrained. Please, Robert, let me in. Just talk to me. A pause. The shuffle of feet. Then, nothing. She slams her palm against the wood. I know you're in there. Please don't do this. The weight of her suitcase topples over behind her, forgotten. Her hands curl into fists, pressing against the door, her forehead resting against its surface as if that alone will force it open. Robert, please. There is a gasp of breath, something between a sob and a plea. She is breaking now, unraveling in the cold, in the quiet, in the absence of the man she once knew. Her voice drops to a whisper. Don't do this to me. Inside, nothing stirs. There is no anger in his silence, no heated words exchanged through the barrier between them, just emptiness, an absence that is louder than any response he could give. She steps back, rubbing her hands over her face. Her fingers are trembling. She fumbles for her phone, thumb hovering over his name. She calls. The rings echo in the hallway. 1, 2, 3. She waits. 4, 5, 6. Then his voicemail. Her breath shudders as she ends the call and types a message. Robert, please, let me in. The screen confirms what she dreads most. Delivered. Seen. No reply. Her hands tighten around the phone, around the last fragile thread connecting her to him. She dials again, this time straight to voicemail. Desperation ignites. She pounds her fist against the door again, shaking it on its hinges. Robert, talk to me. No answer. A sharp sob escapes her lips, and then something breaks. Not in the door, but in her. She slumps against the wall, sliding down until she is sitting on the cold floor, knees pulled to her chest. Time moves strangely now, stretching and warping. She doesn't know how long she sits there. 5 minutes? 10? More? She doesn't know when the tears stop, when exhaustion replaces grief, when the shivering overtakes the anger. At some point, she dials another number. Police, a voice answers. A beat of silence before she speaks, her voice hoarse, fragile. I can't get into my home. She hears herself say it, the absurdity of it settling as the words leave her mouth. I live here, but my husband, he changed the locks. He won't let me in. A pause. Then the response. I'm sorry, ma'am. This is a civil matter. The words land with the weight of finality. She nods, though no one is there to see. She hangs up. Outside, the world continues. Footsteps echo in the stairwell. A neighbor passes without a glance. Cars move along the street below. Inside, beyond the locked door, Robert remains unseen. And the life she once had is no longer hers to enter. Was this justice? Was this cruelty? She does not know. All she knows is that she is alone. Martha did not leave immediately. She stayed outside the flat for what felt like hours. In reality, it was less than one. The cold settled deep in her bones, but she barely noticed. Time no longer had meaning. The door in front of her would not open. The phone in her hand would not ring. And the man she had once built a life with had chosen to erase her. Eventually, she stood. There was nowhere else to go. No home, no sanctuary, just the weight of what had happened pressing down on her as she lifted the suitcase she had once packed with such thoughtfulness. Now nothing more than a collection of things belonging to a person who no longer existed in the world she had known. She walked, past familiar streets that no longer felt like hers, past cafes where she and Robert had once sat, talking about books, about work, about everything that had once mattered. The world around her had not changed, but everything within her had. There was no choice but to call a friend, a name on her contact list that suddenly carried a weight she never thought she would need to lean on. The phone rang, and when the voice on the other end answered, she forced words through the lump in her throat. "Can I stay with you?" The answer was immediate. Yes, no hesitation, but even kindness could not undo what had happened. The next few days passed in a haze. Martha moved from couch to couch, carrying her suitcase from one borrowed space to another. The weight of it dragged at her arms, but it was nothing compared to the weight inside her chest. Sleep came in restless intervals, broken by dreams that felt too close to reality. The moment she tried the key, the silence on the other side of the door, the certainty that she no longer belonged. Friends tried to comfort her. They made tea, poured wine, placed a hand on her shoulder, but there were only so many times a person could say, "I'm sorry," before it lost meaning. They had no answers. They could not undo what had been done. The flat had been as much hers as it was Robert's. She knew, legally, she had a right to return. But law and love do not always follow the same path. The lock had been changed, but more than that, the decision had been made. When she finally went back, it was not as a wife, not as a partner, but as a ghost moving through a space that no longer welcomed her. The tension in the air was thick, pressing against her skin. Robert was rarely there. When he was, he barely spoke. His face was unreadable, his words few. He had built a wall between them, one she could not break down. Experts say that no contact is the most effective form of closure. It is the removal of a person, not just from one's home, but from one's reality. It is an act that sends a message, final, irreversible. Dr. Ramani Durvasula, a psychologist specializing in emotional trauma, explains, for many, the act of going no contact is a form of self-preservation. It removes the temptation to re-engage, to rehash, to be drawn back into something that cannot be repaired. For Robert, it was not about conversation. It was not about fighting. It was about erasing. Martha had once existed in every corner of that flat. Her books on the shelves, her voice in the rooms, her laughter echoing late at night. Now she was a presence only in memory, fading with each passing day. The legal proceedings were inevitable. Papers arrived in stiff envelopes, words typed in emotionless formality. There was no argument, no negotiation, just signatures on paper. A marriage reduced to a legal process. Some betrayals are loud, filled with shouting, accusations thrown like weapons. Others are silent. Robert had chosen silence. It was his revenge. Or perhaps it was his way of moving on. Dr. Harriet Lerner, a relationship expert, once said, "For some, forgiveness is found in conversation. For others, it is found in never speaking again." Martha had wanted to talk. She had wanted to explain, to apologize, to find a way through the wreckage. But Robert had already made his choice. He had walked away without ever turning back. And in the end, that was the wound that never fully healed. In the quiet aftermath, when the papers had been signed and the last of her belongings had been packed away, Martha found herself staring at a reality she had never considered before. It came not in a sudden revelation, but in small moments, fragments of the past that no longer fit as neatly as they once had. A name mentioned offhandedly, a late night that had no explanation, a business trip that had seemed unnecessary. She had been the one accused, the one cast out, the one who bore the weight of betrayal. But was she truly the first to betray? The question crept in slowly, unwelcome yet impossible to ignore. Robert had always been careful, reserved in his emotions, precise in his actions. His ability to detach so completely, to erase her without hesitation. It was not the reaction of a man blindsided. It was the reaction of someone prepared, someone who had already mourned the loss before it happened. And then there was the woman. Martha first heard the name from a mutual acquaintance. Casual, unthinking, the way someone mentions a familiar face at a dinner party. Oh, Robert and then the pause, the awkward shift in tone, the realization that the words should not have been spoken at all. She hadn't asked. She didn't need to. The answer was already there, buried in the details. The woman was someone from his publishing circle, someone he had worked with, someone whose presence, once insignificant, now stood out in sharp relief against the backdrop of their past. The marriage had barely been over before Robert was seen with her. At first, it was just speculation, whispers passed between people who had no real stake in the truth. But speculation became certainty when the news arrived. Robert had remarried. Not years later, not after time had softened the edges of what had happened. Months. Had it already been there, waiting? Had he moved on so quickly because, in truth, he had never been alone? Martha sat with the thought, weighing it, testing it. It should have changed things. It should have made her feel justified. But it didn't. Because in the end, betrayal was betrayal, no matter which way it turned. Was Robert always faithful? Or had she simply been the only one to be caught? There are few wounds deeper than the realization that the person you trusted most has become a stranger. Few betrayals more lasting than the knowledge that the life you built with someone can be discarded like an old photograph. But perhaps the real lesson here is not about right or wrong, not about guilt or innocence. Perhaps it is about the nature of love itself. Love is fragile. It is shaped by effort, by time, by the willingness to hold on even when it is easier to let go. But love is also a choice, and sometimes that choice is to walk away. Some people find closure in conversation, others find it in silence, and some, like Robert, find it in an act so final, so absolute, that there is nothing left to hold on to. Was he a man betrayed, or was he simply a man who no longer cared? And in the end, does it even matter? Could you forgive infidelity, or would you seek revenge? Let us know below. And don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss the next true crime story that will be posted. Stay safe.